1 in 3 Mazdas sold globally is a CX-5, so the Japanese manufacturer has clearly found the right formula. Today I'm driving the facelifted version of the second generation CX-5, although to be fair, calling it the second generation is a bit much, given that the underpinnings, the chassis, and most of the engines and everything was carried over from the first generation, although updates were brought to the formula, of course. In terms of its body, for instance, the biggest change from Generation 1 to Generation 2 was that they moved the A-pillar further back by 3.5 centimeters. This facelift is from 2021, and with it, the vehicle got new and revised front and rear fascias. That certainly look modern, although they cannot hide the fact that this is quite an old vehicle that's being updated so that it stays relevant. My tester is a fully spec'd example. It has the biggest engine available in Europe, the 2.5 liter 194 horsepower engine. This is one of the last reasonably big displacement non-turbo engines that you can get on a car in Europe. Being a Homura trim level car, my tester is close to being a top of the line model. Mazda still offers a Takumi top of the range model, the very pinnacle of the CX-5 range, but I think my tester gets everything that gets, but as options that were added on. The base Prime line version, which is the cheapest you can get, starts at just under 30,000 euros. Then there are several trims in between until you reach Homura, which is 38,590 euros, and it comes pretty much fully spec'd. And then the Takumi starts at 42,190 euros. And the Takumi also gets a brown Napa leather interior. But otherwise, this has everything. So you can essentially order the Homura, but make it a Takumi by ticking individual options to make it a fully spec'd car, just like my tester, which has heated and cooled seats, a heated steering wheel, a heated rear bench, electric seats, dual zone climate control, a glass sunroof that opens, an electric tailgate, which reveals the 522-liter trunk, which you can extend to over 1,600 liters if you fold down the rear seat. There's also a head-up display, which thankfully isn't of the cheap and nasty type with the flippy-uppy screen. This one just projects the information onto the windshield itself, which is great. I'm not an Android Auto user, so I cannot test it, but apparently Mazda fixed the issue where using Android Auto made some information, I think the speed limit, disappear from the head-up display, or I think you couldn't get it to show you navigation information. But now apparently that has been fixed with the facelift. In terms of the way the CX-5 looks, I've always been a fan from the very first generation. Even though I'm not a huge fan of crossovers and SUVs, I have to admit that these have always caught my eye. And the latest version is also the most handsome, if you ask me. I like the headlights that the car got with the facelift. They have a very cool light signature that certainly helps the car look really, really modern. The same goes for the rear, which also gets an updated lighting design that brings it more in line to the very latest Mazda models, like the CX-60, which I drove and loved. And you should check out my review of that car because I really, really loved it. Check out the video to see why I found it so compelling. The CX-5 isn't an especially off-roadsy type of SUV, since its ground clearance is around 19 centimeters. It is just below if you get smaller wheels, or just above 19 centimeters if you get the 19-inch wheels that are on my tester. It does have some SUV traits though, like the doors that cover the sills so that they don't get dirty and then transfer that dirt onto your trouser legs. Nobody will realistically take this car off-road, but it should do fine, especially since one of the 3 driving modes that it offers is called off-road, which I think is only available on CX-5s with all-wheel drive. It locks the power delivery so that it sends more to the rear, and this will help push you out of a tricky off-road situation. Again, this isn't an off-road vehicle, but between its decent ground clearance, all-wheel drive, and this mode that is supposed to help you get traction, it should do all right. The CX-5's interior feels more premium than ever. With the facelift, this car got a new 10 and a bit inch infotainment screen, which looks really, really good. It has great graphics. It's among the better ones in the industry, although it is not among the biggest ones, but 10 inches is fine. Mazda also gave this revised CX-5 its latest digital cluster. It's the same one you can get in pretty much all current Mazda models. And I've previously experienced it on the Mazda 6, and it's really nice. I like the fact that even though it's still just a part digital setup, with its screen in the middle showing an analog speedometer on it, I really like this gauge cluster because the digital and analog parts are really nicely integrated. So the outer parts are analog, the rev counter, the temperature gauge, and the fuel gauge. So RPM is on the left and the other two are on the right. And if you didn't look especially closely, you might be hard-pressed to tell that it's a screen. What I don't understand though is why do you have two fuel gauges? So you have the analog one that I previously mentioned, but right next to it you have it in digital form as well. It's mildly amusing, but I shouldn't complain. I do like that Mazda gives you a proper analog temperature gauge. I cannot not appreciate how soft the armrest is here. Your elbow just sinks into it on the door. It's really nice. The same goes for the central one. They are both equally squishy and nice. Although I would have liked the center one to extend a bit further because when I'm cruising on the highway, my elbow is in midair, and that's not ideal. I can rest my left elbow on the door, but my right one is just dangling here. So this part of the dash is covered in stitched leather, giving it a very nice premium feel. The steering wheel is also covered in leather, as is the armrest and the gear selector, and you really feel like you're in quite a plush car. A couple of negatives though is that I found the center console could have been a bit more securely screwed together, I guess. I sometimes find myself moving it with my knee and the whole thing moves. Another interior related gripe for me is the fact that I feel like I'm sitting way too high in this car. My seat is cranked all the way down. I am 183 centimeters tall, and I don't really have that much headroom. I imagine that somebody who's a basketball player might struggle to be comfortable in the driver's seat. So the steering wheel is thankfully adjustable for both rake and reach. However, in order for me to feel comfortable behind the wheel, I have to put it all the way up. Otherwise, the driving position feels awkward. And remember, this is with the seat in its lowest position. So that's not ideal. The driving position itself is reasonably okay. In order for my legs to feel comfortable, I had to move my seat back a bit. So when I extend my arm, my wrist doesn't quite reach the top of the wheel as it should in order for you to have the best grip on the steering wheel and be as safe as possible on the road. It's a small compromise. I'm not going to endanger anyone with my driving position. I noticed the same high driving position in this car's bigger brother, the CX-60. However, in that car, everything felt just a little bit more sporty than in this car, to be honest. And while I remember criticizing the CX-60 for having quite hard suspension, I have to criticize the CX-5 for having too soft suspension. I mean, it doesn't roll excessively much through the corners, but it does roll quite a bit. You really feel how it adjusts itself around the corners. It's still a reasonably agile and fun to drive vehicle, but it cannot compare with the CX-60. And if you want to buy a sporty Mazda SUV, but can't quite afford the CX-60, maybe wait around and put some more money aside, because it really is that much better if you are a sporty driver such as myself. I mean, for me, there wouldn't be any contest between the CX-5 and the CX-60. I would always choose the latter. The trade-off from having soft-ish suspension is, of course, the vehicle is quite compliant and comfortable over most types of bumps and imperfections in the road. The CX-5 certainly feels light on its feet, especially on twistier roads, and that's because for an SUV measuring nearly 4.6 meters, its 1.6-ish ton curb weight is actually pretty decent, considering how big the vehicle is, the fact that it has a big displacement engine, the 2.5 liter, the fact that it has all-wheel drive, which also adds extra weight. This is of course part of Mazda's Skyactiv philosophy, which aimed to push traditional technologies as far as they could go, which is why the manufacturer, for instance, avoided turbochargers for so long. And in fact, in Europe, you cannot get the CX-5 with a turbocharged gasoline engine. This 194 horsepower unit is the European top of the range. In the US and other markets, there is a turbocharged version of this 2.5 liter. This engine makes 258 Newton meters, which it only delivers at 4,000 RPM. So it may not have the best slowdown response. Whereas the turbocharged version of this has over 400 Newton meters of torque, which you achieve a few thousand RPMs lower. And this completely transforms how the vehicle feels. This still feels relaxed and you can drive it around without having to use much throttle. But when you want to make an overtake and you need some acceleration to get you out of a tight spot, the car will kick down several gears to give you the power that you need. Mazda quotes this vehicle as being able to sprint to 100 kilometers per hour from a standstill in 9.3 seconds, and the quoted top speed is 195 kilometers per hour. I really like that when you're just driving around, you hardly hear the engine. If it's around 2000 RPM, it barely makes its presence felt or heard because there's hardly any vibration. If you stab it, you will hear it, especially since, as I said, the car needs revs in order to give you the kind of progress that you expect. However, now, for instance, I'm driving it at 100 kilometers per hour in 6th gear, which is its final gear, and it's only turning 2000 RPM. And I have to say that at around 130, 140 kilometers per hour, this vehicle is really impressively hushed on the highway. It's also quite well insulated when it comes to wind noise. You really don't hear much. And it's also reasonably good on fuel too. At around 130 kilometers per hour, the vehicle was showing me a constant fuel consumption of 9.2 liters per 100 kilometers. At 150, it was almost 11, which is about as much as the vehicle uses when driving it in town. Mazda says that the fact that this new version of the CX-5 is now a mild hybrid, that it is noticeably more efficient than before. And this is going to be especially noticeable in town, where the integrated starter generator, which not only generates electricity and starts the vehicle up, but it also provides a temporary boost of torque. And that really helps this vehicle in town. It makes the automatic stop and start system smoother. You hardly feel the engine cutting in and out. And when you're accelerating, it does somewhat compensate this naturally aspirated engine's lack of torque lowdown. Mazda has included a handy power flow thing in the infotainment, which is what I've kept on the screen most of the time when I didn't need navigation. And it shows you when the cylinder deactivation feature is active and where electricity is flowing to and from. I like that this car has a physical button for everything. You can turn most features off with a dedicated button. And there are even some hidden buttons. So for instance, if you get the heated rear bench, the buttons to enable that are actually hidden in the armrest. You can also just randomly start the front-facing camera, or I think you can cycle through them. Yeah, you can cycle through your cameras. One of the new features for the CX-5 facelift is this surround view camera system, which is actually quite good. The cameras are of decent quality, and this really helps you when reversing, especially since, because this car has wide and slightly sporty looking flanks in the rear, I found it harder to approximate the size of the vehicle, harder than in other comparable vehicles. Although I will say that having the small quarter light poking a hole through the C-pillar, it really does help you with over the shoulder and rear visibility. And combined with the camera system, you will not be able to use the "I didn't see it" excuse in a CX-5. And unlike older versions of this model, it has most safety and tech features that you could think of. So it has adaptive cruise control, which does a good job of maintaining a safe distance to the car in front, as well as keeping the car dead center in its lane. It also has blind spot warning and monitoring, and yeah, it's really a good proposition. I can totally understand why this vehicle is so popular, especially since car buyers these days have caught the SUV bug and everything has to be tall. If it's not tall, they ain't buying it. And this has had a dramatic effect on what types of vehicles the automotive industry as a whole produces. But there you go. buyers dictate what they want and automakers are only too happy to oblige. I like the Mazda CX-5. I think it's a competent, good-looking, spacious, and quite premium feeling proposition for a price that doesn't really reflect this. I mean, it's not a cheap car, but it's not as expensive as actual premium cars. So I think with that, Mazda is onto something. I'm sure this model will keep selling well until Mazda decides to take it out of production. Although I'm not sure which engine to recommend. I do like the smoothness and the pleasant power delivery of this 2.5 liter, but it's not the best on fuel. I mean, smaller displacement, turbocharged rivals feel more muscular, low down, and use less gasoline. Honestly, if you live in Europe, I would just recommend you get the more powerful of the two diesels. It's still the same 2.2 liter, an updated version of it, of course. It's the same unit that Mazda has sold for over 10 years now, an updated version of it, of course, and you can get it with either 150 or 184 horsepower, and either an automatic 6-speed or a manual 6-speed gearbox. I would recommend the diesel engine for those who do a lot of out-of-town miles, as they will use the least fuel possible. If you plan to use your CX-5 more in town than out of town, then I also cannot recommend this 2.5 liter, or all-wheel drive for that matter, because the larger displacement and all-wheel drive both have a negative effect on efficiency. So what I would recommend you get is the 2 liter with 165 horsepower, naturally aspirated 4-cylinder. And unless you really cannot drive stick, you should get the 6-speed manual, because it is pleasant to use, it gives you more control, and it just gives you a better hands-on feel of driving the vehicle. This 6-speed automatic is fine. There's nothing especially notable about it, other than the fact that Mazda says it has been designed to promote efficiency. It's not a sporty gearbox, and even if you put it in manual mode and change gears with the paddles, it's still gonna shift up for you at redline, hinting at the type of car that it is. Overall, this car gives me a feeling that it is an old school vehicle. It has fewer screens, it has physical controls, it doesn't feel especially technologically advanced, even though it kind of is. It's by no means a rudimentary car. And I see what Mazda is doing here with the whole premium feel and sexy exterior design thing that they got going on. So I think that as long as the CX-5 will be on sale, it will keep selling well. And if you want to buy one, go ahead and buy one. I have heard that the 2.2 liter diesel engines aren't the most reliable, but I've learned to take such reports with a grain of salt, because, well, you should do preventative maintenance on your vehicle, and you shouldn't really follow the manufacturer's servicing intervals. They should be more frequent if you want to keep the car for long and make sure you can depend on it. This pretty much sums up my Mazda CX-5 review. If you enjoyed the video, like it and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.